Hi, James. Thank you so much for joining this interview.
Thanks, Max. It's good to be here. Looking forward to today.
So, actually, last year in October, we kind of randomly ended up at a dinner together and sat next to each other. And you told me about the story of how you founded Neurohacker, and I really enjoyed the conversation that evening. And I thought afterwards, hey, we should just have recorded that and put it on YouTube. So that's what we're doing right now. That's why I'm really happy, because I think the story is really interesting. So just for the maybe 3 people who are watching this right now and those 3 people don't know what Neurohacker is, how would you sum it up in like a couple of sentences? What is Neurohacker Collective?
It's funny, it's always hard for me to try to sum it up shortly because of the complexity of what we do, but I think the simplest way to say it is that we are advancing a new model of medicine based on complex system science. And we're basically a research and development organization using complex systems modeling to develop products and scientific methodologies for increasing human capacity. We're best known for our work in cognitive function, but now that that's well established, we're taking that same modeling and applying it to longevity and sleep and anxiety and a whole series of different aspects of both physiological and sort of psychological health. But through this sort of complex systems approach where we're working to be able to provide significant benefit in the short term, while helping to increase the body's sort of self-regulatory and adaptive capacity so that whatever underlying challenges there are that are causing the breakdown start to heal in the process of being able to address it both short term and long term. That was probably more than 2 sentences, but
Yeah, and you guys are selling really interesting nootropics, really interesting, could you say supplemental products or nutraceuticals, which I also tested a bunch of your products and I'm really a big fan of them. How did you come up with Neurohacker? What was the original point where you started Neurohacker Collective and how did you start it? Can you walk us through the progress?
Absolutely. So Neurohacker was something that the inspiration started almost 15 years ago, but it took quite a while for it to really materialize. When I was 18, I ended up taking over a vocational college that taught alternative medicine and alternative psychology. And I started running that school, which was an extraordinary experience, but realistically far more complex than I was capable of as an 18-year-old. And so I made up for my lack of skill and understanding through just sheer work. But I did it to such an extent that basically for the first 3 years, I never slept more than 2 hours. And so by the time I was 21, I had hit a pretty severe degree of burnout and ended up getting diagnosed with stage 3 adrenal exhaustion, and was just struggling and kind of across the board. My cognitive function had gone down. It was almost impossible for me to focus. I was unhappy, which then created an existential crisis because I was doing this work that I felt was deeply important in the world. I had, this mission that I was on, and I was miserable, which was very confusing. So I started exploring what the kind of paths and opportunities were for me to heal. And along the way, there was a bunch of things I tried, but I ended up getting introduced to this doctor in Mexico, a man named Dr. William Hitt, who had developed a specialized IV protocol for rapidly repairing neurotransmitter damage. And most of his research was actually based on healing brain challenges that were caused by severe drug abuse. But when I sat and went over my health with him, he basically said that, the damage that I had experienced was comparable to had I been a heroin addict because of how hard I pushed myself. He's like, so basically the same protocol should make a big difference. So I ended up going down. I did 3 days of this IV treatment for 8 or 9 hours a day. And it just completely changed my world in a way that I hadn't expected because I spent a lot of time around medicine growing up and kind of knew what the potentials of it were. And so I didn't expect anything to be as profound as this was. But in the course of 3 days, I went from struggling in almost every facet of life to all of a sudden my cognitive function not only came back to where I had previously experienced it, but went up dramatically across a number of different types of brain function. My happiness came back, my sense of motivation and capacity came back. But the thing that really struck me was that after I had done that IV treatment, my sense of empathy increased dramatically. And, I grew up studying spiritual traditions and had a understanding of the way in which people and life are sort of interconnected, but it was always something that I held in much more of a kind of philosophical or cognitive framework and wasn't something that I actually experienced. And after I did this IV treatment, all of a sudden I could no longer think about anything that I wanted to do in my life without automatically starting to think about and feel into the impacts of those actions on everyone around me and the world at large. And so as I had that experience, this sort of like aha went off, and I was like, holy shit, this could make a massive difference in the world if we could figure out how to bring this type of thing out to people at scale. Okay. And the sort of inspiration was this idea of, what if we could make hundreds of thousands or millions of people dramatically more intelligent, dramatically more capable and motivated, and dramatically more empathetic, so that they had an intrinsic motivator to want to use that increased intelligence and that increased capacity, not only for personal gain, but for the benefit of their families, their communities, and ultimately the world at large. And I was seeing this as a way to both improve quality of life for individuals, but at least as importantly, starting to make it so that we had dramatically more people that were starting to work on the hard problems of the world. And, by this point, I had already launched a couple of nonprofits. I was working on a bunch of different hard problems for the world, but the deeper I got into that, the more that it became just utterly evident that nothing I could do was going to be sufficient for the scope of the problems that face the world. And so as I started to really contemplate it, what became clear was that the thing that I could do that would have the greatest impact on the world would be to help to increase the number of people who had the right kinds of skills, capacities, and motivations to do whatever it is that is uniquely theirs to do, because there's so many different challenges that need addressed, and that ultimately that was the place that could have the most impact. And so that was really where the concept behind Neurohacker was born. Unfortunately, the man that developed that treatment ended up passing away quite shortly after I did my treatment with him. Because initially the inspiration was partner with him and start to open IV clinics all over the world to scale that out, because it was the only thing I'd ever come across that had that type of capacity. When he passed away, and much of his research also passed away with him, but the inspiration never went away. And so I then spent the next, quite a number of years exploring this concept, meeting with different formulators and neuroscientists and chemists, and everyone that heard about this idea thought it was beautiful, but they also thought it was insane, because the idea that we could have some type of relatively simple intervention that would cause that much benefit across that many areas of life just seemed fundamentally impossible. And so it wasn't actually until about 5 years ago, the inspiration around this came back up very strongly, actually right after doing a LSD journey at Burning Man. But the inspiration came up, and at that point it just became clear to me that no matter how hard it was to accomplish this, the importance of it was too high to not dive into it. And so right after Burning Man, I started sharing the inspiration with my brother. And about an hour in, as he really got the scope of what it was that I was talking about and wanting to do, he looked over at me and said, all right, I'm in. And this was a really remarkable thing, because my brother's background is in complex system science, and he was one of the few people in the world at the time who could have potentially been able to do the development for something like this. Because it really did require a fundamentally new approach to science. The sort of reductionist approach to science that had existed was just simply not sufficient for the thing that we were trying to accomplish. So he ended up agreeing to partner with me, and we spent basically the rest of the drive home from Burning Man starting to develop the plan, and then came home and immediately dove into R&D for about 2 years. That's kind of how we got here.
Wow. So you mentioned a lot of empathy is important because your plan, when I understand it correctly, is really to have empathy and intelligence to solve, a lot of problems. Can you go more into it? Why you think empathy is so important and how we solve like global existential issues with that?
In the world that we live in today, there's this common sort of belief and understanding that we're all relatively separate and that it's possible to do actions to advantage ourselves at the expense of others, whether that's people, animals, the environment. But people will commonly make decisions to do something that's beneficial for them, knowing that it will cause harm for somebody else. And that's a worldview that just fundamentally doesn't work and is actually not true, right? If someone ends up, let's say that a corporation wants to improve its bottom line, and the fastest and easiest way for it to do that is to dump its wastewater into a stream, and as opposed to dealing with it properly, well, they have a financial incentive to do that. And based on this idea that we're all separate, that seems like a logical and reasonable thing to do. But the reality is we're not all separate, right? And the CEO of that corporation that's making that decision isn't taking into account the fact that his family that he cares about lives downstream and will end up being impacted by the effects of those actions. And even if it's not his family, ultimately a number of people are. So, what I view as the sort of fundamental necessity for how we move from where we are in the world today towards a world that actually has the capacity to support life in a thriving way across all of humanity is that we fundamentally let go of this idea that we are separate and that it's possible to advantage ourselves at the expense of the other. And that the only path forward is to recognize the fundamental interconnectedness and the extent to which we rely on one another, we rely on the environment, we rely on sort of the ecosystem as a whole, and that ultimately what is in our best interest is actually what is in the collective interest. And this is essentially what empathy is, right? The ability to feel and grok what the experience of another is, whether it's a person or a tree or whatever, but being able to actually tune into and understand what is this other sentient life's experience and how can I impact it, hopefully in a positive fashion. And that's really what empathy supports and allows for. And so when I look at how we can move in the direction of having a world that really supports the happiness, the thriving of all of life, ultimately, I think that the basis of that is a shift in consciousness based on empathy, based on an understanding of the way in which we actually are interconnected and the way in which what benefits any of us ultimately benefits all of us. And that's the sort of fundamental shift that I'm trying to work towards and hoping to inspire both through what we do in terms of product, but also through education and information.
Mm-hmm. You just mentioned product, but also education. How are you working on raising empathy? What do you think? How can people raise their own empathy if they are aware they want to raise their empathy level? What can we do, or what are you doing?
Well, in terms of, so what we're doing at Neurohacker is sort of a combination of trying to support this concept biochemically, right? And that's the product side, being able to provide the right kinds of nutrients that will not only support optimal brain function, but will actually support the parts of the brain and nervous system responsible for things like empathy and compassion, so that there's actually a greater physiological capacity to be able to move in that direction. But then because that concept is something that's still culturally sort of so foreign, just developing that physiological capacity in and of itself is not sufficient. You also have to start to work on the understanding and the sort of psychological side. And so for that, we also do quite a lot of education through our podcast, we do talk about health and different aspects of kind of cutting edge medicine, but we also spend a substantial amount of time looking at and discussing existential risks and what are some of the major things that people can do to not only improve their own quality of life, but quality of life writ large. And similarly, we do that through articles and all types of different education. In terms of what people can do kind of individually to enhance empathy, there's a lot of things. Mainly, it's actually just a intention, right? When someone starts to shift their focus and their intention away from how do I benefit myself maximally to how do I benefit myself while supporting the greater good, that shift in desire and that shift in attention will ultimately start to increase automatically the capacity for empathy and for greater understanding. But there is also the ability to do it very intentionally. And the way that I like to look at it and do it is to sort of vision myself being able to fully step into the experience of another person, and through their eyes, through their experience, try to understand what their come from is. So for instance, if I've got an argument or conflict happening with somebody, the general propensity is to only listen to what they're sharing to the extent that I now know how I can respond to tell them that they're wrong. Right? This is how most people like to do communication, but it's not very effective and it doesn't actually feel very good. And so a much more effective practice around that is to allow myself to actually step completely out of my own experience and fully into their experience, and without any defenses, without any desire to argue or to be right, to just deeply try to understand and to feel what they feel, and to be able to get why their perspective actually makes sense and is potentially even healthy from their framework. And then in getting them, either my state will shift because I now have an understanding of something that I didn't, or I'm going to be in a position to be able to share with them what it is that is the misunderstanding in a way that they can actually take in, so that we end up being in a better state and fundamentally more connected, leaving the conversation versus potentially just arguing. So it's that process of stepping out of one's own experience enough that you can let go of the defenses while you step into someone else's experience and allow yourself to actually feel what they feel.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a hands-on training or a hands-on method on how to coach people to do this, or how people can coach themselves? And I would also be wondering, at Neurohacker Collective, in your company, in the office, do you teach this to your employees, that they communicate in that certain way?
Yeah, good questions. Unfortunately, we don't have any type of structured hands-on training yet. It's something that I'm looking forward to creating, but just in the scope of all the things we're working on, we haven't gotten there yet. I did do the TEDx talk on empathy, I think it was last year, that goes a bit more into some practices. But yeah, it's something that we're looking to develop. But it is definitely something that's deeply incorporated into sort of the company culture here. And it's not even something that we actually have to do in a very formal way, right? There's no one who comes to work for Neurohacker who isn't deeply invested in and aligned with the bigger mission of what we're trying to do. It just wouldn't make sense, right? Because we're trying to do this crazy revolutionary thing, the work here is really hard. And we're a startup, so we don't pay nearly as well as a big corporation would. No one's here for the common motivations. They're all here because of the buy-in to the bigger vision. And so that in and of itself makes it really easy to kind of create the right culture and induce empathy. But it is also something that anytime there is a breakdown between employees, the way that we support and facilitate those is really oriented around helping to create a deep understanding of what's happening for the other person and vice versa, and bring people back into alignment, as opposed to just telling one person they're wrong or telling the other person what to do. And, it's pretty remarkable. I've launched, 25 or so companies in my life. And what we have here is just extraordinary in terms of the team dynamics and the way in which people genuinely care about each other and go out of their way to help each other and invest in each other's happiness and success. And, in most companies, if something goes wrong, the orientation on everyone's part is to say, oh, it's that guy's fault, or it's that department's fault, or, right? And we just don't have that. If something doesn't go the way that we had planned, we actually have sort of the opposite, where everyone takes accountability, even if it wasn't their thing. And they all sort of step up to say, how can we do better? How can, or if there is an identification to say, oh, it's, a breakdown in this department, it's not just those people who are going to work on it. Anyone who has the time and capacity will automatically start to show up and support. And so it just creates a really extraordinary working environment, and something that's conducive to a lot of collaboration and, happiness in spite of the difficulty of the work that we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, it's fascinating how you can motivate the team through the aligned vision that you guys have at Neurohacker. Talking about the vision and the future of Neurohacker Collective, what is your plan for the future? Can you tell us a little bit about the next years? What do you plan?
Yeah. So, for the next couple of years, where we're really focused is taking this same complex systems approach in research and development and applying it across some of the most common health challenges, and particularly focusing on the ones that don't have adequate solutions in the world. So anything where there's already a relatively good solution, either naturally or allopathically, it's not really the area that we're going to prioritize. We prioritize essentially the hardest things, which are oftentimes also the most important. So, to date, we've had most of our work on cognitive function, and then starting last year, we moved into increasing life expectancy, and we started working on energy as well. Where we're kind of headed over the next while is that we're actually in late stage development right now around sleep support, but again, a totally different approach than the way that people would normally think of it. Right? Almost everything right now that exists in the realm of sleep is through heavy sedation, and most of the solutions that are out there will cause you to sleep, but they don't actually support a good quality of sleep. And so you'll end up getting more hours than you might have otherwise, but it doesn't actually improve the quality of life in a meaningful way. So rather than taking the sedative approach, we're taking a restorative approach and looking at being able to provide the right kinds of nutrients that will support the maximum degree of restoration during sleep, so that as people are sleeping, they're actually able to heal and wake up feeling more rested, feeling more refreshed.
Could you also see that actually in the deep sleep score of an Oura Ring, the difference?
We're starting to. We're actually hoping to launch a kind of bigger pilot test using Oura soon. Right now, we've been doing quite a bit of testing using different kinds of surveys and subjective reporting, but we are looking to do more quantified versions as well. And so we're looking to do something with Oura, and then we're also working with a couple of other organizations to look at what are sort of the best scientific approaches right now for quantifying sleep quality and being able to go down that path. But sleep is kind of our next big area. Following that, we're planning to work on support around anxiety and mood challenges, which again, just a massive issue, right? Just in the US alone, last article I read on it showed that there's 92 million prescriptions every year for benzodiazepines, which are the class of drugs used for treating anxiety. And so that both tells you how critical the need is, how many people are suffering from different kinds of anxiety challenges, but it also highlights a deeply kind of terrifying issue, which is benzos are the most addictive class of chemicals that exist. And because of the way that they work within physiology and cause the body to generally stop being able to produce the right kinds of neurotransmitters that it needs to for self-regulation around anxiety, you end up becoming chemically dependent on them quite quickly and easily, making it very hard to get off. And then they have a whole series of health challenges that come with them. So again, another area where there's a huge challenge, and the solutions that currently exist just aren't actually adequate. And so we're looking at how can we make a material difference there. And then more than likely, our next major category after that is going to be trying to address physiological pain. but we're not entirely certain if that'll actually be the order of it. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, over the next few years, what we're focused on is taking the approach to medicine that we've developed and starting to apply it across different aspects of physiology, but also psychology to the extent that it's mediated through physiology, and trying to develop key solutions across all the different domains. Beyond that, there's a lot of things that we're really deeply interested in and we hope to be working on, but we don't necessarily have as fully formalized plans because they do go a ways out. But we've seen that this new approach to medicine that we're working with not only has the ability to support health optimization or minor health challenges, but actually has the ability to fundamentally sort of reshape how medicine is approached across everything. Because when you look at most of traditional allopathic medicine, what medicine right now is extraordinarily good at is the ability to treat acute disorders. Right? So if you get into a car accident and you break bones, you don't want to go to an acupuncturist or an energy healer or anything like that. You want to go to the hospital because they're extremely good at being able to fix that kind of thing. And any kind of issue where there's a very clear causation, generally speaking, medicine is pretty good at being able to address a solution for it. But as soon as you start to get into complex disorders, right? So things like autoimmune diseases, cancers, neurodegenerative disorders, things like that, medicine doesn't actually have a cure for a single one. And it's because the approach that is currently being used doesn't actually support it. Because if someone gets cancer or an autoimmune disorder, there is not a single causation for it. Right? It's a multifaceted causation, and it's not always the same multifaceted causation. Right? For one person, it may be that they got mold exposure and a head trauma, and the combination of the way that those things worked in their body caused the development of a cancer. But for another person, it might be exposure to heavy metals and years of excess stress. Right? And typically, it's not just two causes either. It's much, much more than that. So medicine right now doesn't really have an approach that allows for the understanding of complex disorders and then the effective treatment of them. So ultimately, where we're headed is being able to advance this model of medicine such that it can make its way all the way into traditional allopathy and start to shift the fundamental approach to allow for the capacity to understand and treat all disorders, not just the simple ones. For the next while, though, we're focused on doing that through the realm of supplements and with products that are available to the general public. And that was something that we kind of strategically decided on because in order for us to be able to demonstrate the efficacy of this scientific model and to advance it, not just through our company, but hopefully throughout the world at large, we needed to be able to show the effects. And if we were to go more of a medical approach initially, it would have taken many, many years because of having to go through all of the FDA trials and approvals. And, we wouldn't have been able to show efficacy for at least probably close to a decade. And with the approach that we're doing now, it allows us to demonstrate these capacities at a pretty good scale across a number of different areas of health. And then once that becomes better understood and better established, then it allows for moves into even harder things to address.
Wow, that's a really big vision. So you're actually not just solving like individual like health topics, but also the big vision is also to like really revolutionize medicine. Could you say so, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, ultimately, that's the goal. It's something that is deeply necessary, and there's incredible work being done throughout the field in this, but unfortunately, most of the money that's going into research and most of the time and effort that's going into research is still based on a relatively reductionist approach to science, and as a result, you see tens of billions of dollars getting dumped into cancer research, and yet relatively little progress being made. And ultimately, it's going to require a different approach in order to address these things, and that's what we're hoping to do. Is both have as much impact on that as we directly can, and as, if not more importantly, create the understanding around this different model and create the inspiration for other people to additionally take and run with it. Right? We're not oriented around proprietary knowledge. It's actually sort of antithetical to who we are as an organization. You'll similarly see that, unlike most product companies in the space that show these proprietary blends where you don't really know exactly what you're putting in your body, we made a strategic decision right at the very beginning that we would never do that, and that we're always going to publish exactly what amounts of each ingredient, what form of each ingredient. And of course that makes it much easier if someone wanted to try to take and knock off our products. We're essentially giving them the information to do that. But ultimately, our aim in developing this company is not just to maximize profit, but it is to maximize collective benefit. And in my view, it's critical that education is a key part of that, and that whatever it is that we're researching and understanding, that we try to bring that to light as best we possibly can, so that it's not just our small little group of people working on this, but ultimately starts to become hundreds, thousands of researchers working on the same kind of concept.
Let's talk about some of your products. For example, Qualia Mind. You mentioned the combination of empathy and intelligence that you want to raise. With intelligence, I tried it myself, and I could also measure it with a quantified mind test. I did it in a review, and I had like 7% more higher scores when I took Qualia Mind versus when I didn't take it. Of course, that's just like a n=1 like little fun experiment. But I think a lot of people that I know that are trying a lot of supplements and nootropics, they really like Qualia Mind, and it's also my favorite nootropic. So I would say like intelligence, I can probably attest that. But how would you say your current products, do they already raise empathy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's actually one of my favorite things about the company is getting to read some of the testimonials that come in. Because of course we get a lot of people writing in talking about how they feel smarter, they feel more capable, they're doing better at their job, they're not procrastinating, and those things all feel really good. But one of the things that we hear really commonly is people writing in sort of surprised at how much more present they feel to their life. Right? Most people don't use the terminology of empathy because it's just not a common word. It's not what the frame which people are thinking through, but they're essentially describing the same thing, right? And they're saying, wow, I've noticed that I'm not as impacted by stress as I was. And when a big stressor comes up, I'm better able to handle it and I bounce back more effectively. And as a result, I'm better able to pay attention to and hear the people in my life. Right? I can listen to my wife more effectively. I can understand what her needs are more effectively. I feel more present. I feel like these are the kinds of things that people say on a continual basis. And it's essentially their way of describing this increase in empathy.
I also definitely feel when I take Qualia Mind, I'm more present in general. And that also is really feasible when I'm talking to people one-on-one. I feel like super focused in the conversation. So yeah, I guess people often don't use the word empathy, as you say, but they just feel more connected than to the people they speak to.
Right. And this really is a key thing, because increasing intelligence without also increasing empathy actually can often become a very dangerous prospect. Right? I actually remember when we were first doing R&D and we were playing with different kinds of compounds and different formulas. We went through a phase where we were focused on different aspects of brain function, but weren't paying as much attention to the empathy part in that formulation. And so we ended up developing this sort of prototype that my brother and I were both taking, and it was amazing. We were both just like flying, and we could get so much work done. And I mean, I could power through things in 2 hours that would normally take me 8, but I was moving at such a fast pace that whenever other people weren't, I would get frustrated with them. And actually, after a month or so of us playing with all these different compounds, both of our girlfriends came to us and they're like, hey guys, really happy that you're working on this and we're seeing some benefits, but you're also kind of being a dick. so can you work on that? And we're like, oh, okay, good point. And so we went back and started reformulating with a focus on really being able to enhance the sense of compassion, understanding, empathy, and ultimately landed with something pretty wonderful. And still are able to produce significant benefits in cognitive function. For the longest time, we mostly had subjective reporting on that, but then we now have done a couple of pilot studies being able to actually quantify it. Unfortunately, we haven't yet figured out a way to quantify increases in empathy, so we don't have the studies on that. We have subjective reporting, but in terms of cognitive function, we did a few studies, but the kind of main one we did was through Cambridge Brain Sciences, and this is they have what is considered sort of the gold standard in cognitive assessments, and they have the capacity to test 12 distinctly different types of brain function, right? Things like critical thinking skills, problem solving, verbal reasoning, etc. And this same methodology has been used now in well over 300 clinical trials across like 8 million people. So there's a huge base of information that we got to compare our results against. And from our understanding, most of the different products that they've tested before, whether natural things or more chemical things like caffeine, Adderall, modafinil, etc., would generally show an increase of about 4% across the different cognitive domains. Obviously, some were more, some were less, but that was kind of the blended average. When we did our study, the lowest increase we saw was a 10.5% increase, and then the highest we saw was an 85.4% increase in concentration. And that was after people just being on the product for a week. And based on how the products work, they do become effective essentially day one, but they also become increasingly effective over time. And so the results become increasingly interesting. But yeah, we've been able to see that the approach that we're using actually does allow for dramatically improved results, both in the short term, while helping to address long-term benefit, so that even if someone was to take the product for a chunk of time and then stop, they're in a fundamentally healthier and better place than had they never started it to begin with.
What's your own personal nootropic intake, or are you still doing NAD IVs? Can you tell us a bit? What do you do? What do you take to improve yourself?
I personally have sort of a mad chemist orientation. So I tend to try all kinds of things on a pretty regular basis. My sort of staple is the caffeine-free version of Qualia Mind. I'm personally a slow metabolizer of caffeine, and so I'll have some on occasion, but generally I steer away from it. So I'll do that. Over time, I've actually needed less of it though, which is nice. It's one of the common reports that we get from people that as they've taken the product for a number of months or a number of years, they notice that they get the same benefit out of increasingly lower dosages, which is obviously totally the opposite of what you see in almost every other domain. So now, rather than the full dose of 7 capsules, most days I'll do 3 or 4. And that's sort of my base that works really well. And that's pretty much all I do most days. And then certain days I'll tack on other things depending on what I'm trying to work on. And so, if I need to do a project with extreme kind of like hyper focus, I might take a little bit of phenylpiracetam with it. Or if I am having a day where I think I'm going to be a little more anxious, I might take some aniracetam with it. Or if I'm doing a more creative project, I might microdose with it. So I'll blend in different things depending on what it is that I'm trying to accomplish or what state I feel like I need to be in. But Qualia Mind really is kind of my base that works really well. And then now I also do Eternus on a daily basis, which is pretty great. That product turned out to just actually was surprising to me how effective it has been.
What could you measure or what could you feel? Because I'm trying to work on my own 2 months review, and I'm right now discussing with an oncologist, with a doctor, to which like blood work we should do before and how we should do the tests over time. So I'd be really interested, and I got some feedback already from Greg Kelly, but I would be really interested what you guys see so far, or what you are looking for, what you feel.
Well, Eternus was a really different approach for us than most everything else, because all the stuff that we had done in cognition prior to that, it was with a heavy focus on being able to produce effect immediately, right? Almost everyone who takes any of the Qualia products feels them day one, or if they have a lot of sleep deprivation, it might take 2 or 3 days, but very few people go more than a week without feeling it. With Eternus, where the focus was improving longevity and overall health, particularly by improving cellular metabolism and cellular energy output, that wasn't something that we originally thought we could actually develop to produce a noticeable benefit in short term. It was something that we anticipated was going to take a much longer duration before people would start to see the effects. And to a certain extent that's true, but the feedback that we've been getting from people is that the vast majority of people within the first 1 to 2 weeks start noticing improvements in overall energy levels. They start noticing improvements in things like recovery time after injury or after workouts, as well as improvements in sleep and then sort of overall mood. And of course it makes sense, right? If your cells are all able to produce more energy, reproduce more effectively, etc., you're going to expect that everything's going to get better. It was just the pace at which that started to happen was beyond the scope of what I had anticipated. And I've had that same experience. I would say after about 2 weeks for me, I started noticing that I was recovering faster after workouts. I noticed that I was, waking up just feeling a little bit more energetic and ready to kind of start my day. I started noticing the ability to get better quality sleep as well as slightly more sleep. And so those were all pretty impactful. We're currently doing a couple pilot studies on this so that we can show more of the quantified benefits. Right now, most of what we have is quantified subjective reporting, but we actually just participated in a study to test NAD levels in the blood before and after taking the product. We don't have the results back from it yet, but we will I believe in the next few weeks. Those are supposed to be wrapping up. There's a couple other studies we're working on to test different aspects of biological aging and be able to show those differences. So those results will be starting to come out relatively soon, but what we're already finding from kind of quantifying all the subjective reporting is these improvements in overall energy, sort of overall happiness and well-being and recovery time, and then starting to hear more and more about improvements in sleep, which is all quite exciting.
James, thank you so much for this interview. It was really interesting to hear the story from your perspective and the background and the big vision for Neurohacker.
Yeah, well, thank you. This was good. I enjoyed getting to have this conversation. Appreciate you taking the time.
Is there anything else you want to add, you wish to share?
Yeah, for people who are particularly interested in what we're working on, one thing that is worth noting is that we just launched a brand new beta program, and it's an opportunity for people to come sign up for the beta program, which then allows them to participate in a lot of the studies that we're doing.
I saw that and I signed up, but it's only for US people, I think.
Right now it is. We will hope to expand that, but just logistically, we haven't gotten out of the borders yet. And so, yeah, hopefully that will start to expand. But that's, I think, a really intriguing area for people to look at if they're interested in this kind of work. And then, also checking out the podcast, because we do have some pretty remarkable people that have been on there.
Collective Insights?
Yeah, Collective Insights. Yeah.
We will link this.
Well, thank you. This was really fun.
Thank you again.
Yeah.
My pleasure.
My pleasure.
It was, I think it's really great that we did it, because I found there were only really few interviews with you on YouTube, actually. So I'm really happy to share that.
Yeah, because we're a heavy science organization, I've tended to have our scientists do most of the interviews, because I'm really not a scientist. I'm a lay person who has a deep interest in the topic, and I'm good at and oriented towards accomplishing things. But ultimately I need the scientists to be able to make any of this vision real. And given that that's kind of the basis of what we're doing, we've tended to have them do most of the public work. But as we've grown, people have become increasingly interested in understanding kind of why we're doing what we're doing, because I think people can tell that there really is a different approach, not only in terms of medicine, but also in terms of sort of the philosophy of how we run the organization.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've been starting to do a bit more interviews to talk on those topics.
I hope you enjoyed this interview with James as much as I did. If you want to try out any Neurohacker product, you can use my coupon code MAXHACK to get 15% of any Neurohacker order. And you can also find my 1-year Qualia Mind review here on my YouTube, and also an interview with Greg Kelly, who's the lead formulator at Neurohacker Collective. Thank you for watching.